Hello everyone, I'm Ben Contreras and welcome to another episode of Ben Talks About. Well, 2021 is very close and basically on the verge of ending with it being December and even closer to Christmas. And I gotta say, this year has definitely been quite the big year for Nintendo fans. Not only did we get successful titles like Mario Party Superstars for the Switch, which was a great follow-up to the original Mario Party series of games, and a great apology for Mario Party the Top 100 on the 3DS. We got ourselves the Generation 4 remix of Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl that people have been looking forward to since the release of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire back on the 3DS. Metroid came back from extinction with the release of Metroid Dread, which is a game that I definitely want to do a second video on. And I think most importantly of all, we got ourselves a Nintendo Switch port of possibly one of the most, if not the most divisive Zelda game in the entire franchise, The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. I've had this game for quite a while now. If you saw some of my previous videos, I actually showed off the fact that I had this game in my possession. So I've had it for quite a while. I've played through quite a bit of the game. I'm saying that, and I've only beaten around the first 3 dungeons. And so I decided to go ahead and give you all a sort of first impressions video on it. Now, this game, as I said before, is a very divisive game in the Zelda community. Lots of people either really enjoy the game, or they say that it's one of the worst games in the entire series. In my personal opinion, I definitely do think that it's garnered quite a lot of hate for reasons that I don't necessarily agree on, but I will definitely say that while this may not be my absolute favorite Zelda game, I don't really think I've played enough Zelda games to really garner a sort of opinion like that, but it is definitely a game that I really enjoy and something that I would highly recommend to you. But before I go any further, let me just clarify a couple things. One, I'm not really going to be dedicating this video to anything involving the story, mostly because I've only been through the first third of the game, and I don't really feel qualified to sort of judge it on its story with that regard, because, as you know, Zelda games are by nature extremely long and very story driven. But from what I've seen so far, it is definitely a very interesting sort of story. It takes place during before any of the other previous Zelda games, so you know the world of Hyrule hasn't been entirely established yet. But from what I do have in the story, it is definitely I'm not quite sure if I would describe the story as laid back per se, but it is definitely a game where it does sort of feel like a sort of laid back kind of adventure. At least the first third of the game is. I'm pretty sure the games later on are going to go into more epic moments as the game reaches closer and closer to its conclusion. But as of right now, the game is definitely a lot more laid back than compared to other Zelda games like Twilight Princess or any of the older Zelda games like Majora's Mask or Ocarina of Time and all that. It definitely feels like a more... It has a lot more of a relaxing sort of feeling to it. The characters are also, I feel like the developers were trying to establish how do I say this? It seems like the game is trying to give a lot more of the side characters a lot more personality compared to other games in the Zelda series. There are definitely a lot of them are involved in one of the many side quests in the game, which definitely gives me a lot of vibes similar to Majora's Mask, although this game is definitely not as crazy as Majora's Mask, but it has the same feeling where it makes you want to care about the side characters, and it makes you want to, see, what they're going through in the story, especially when you go through some of the side quests that you get to go through towards the beginning of the game. The overall, so yeah, I'm not gonna necessarily get into too many huge spoilers, but so far in terms of the story, I do feel like it is it's very good at introducing people, to the world they're trying to establish. Now, me personally, I don't necessarily play these type of games for their story, so the main thing that I feel like most people were sort of concerned about were the ways that the game was going to be played. Now, the one thing that you have to understand, for those of you who don't know, Zelda Skyward Sword originally was a game that came out exclusively for the Nintendo Wii. And with that in mind, it definitely did use a lot of motion controls. Pretty much the entire game was based around you swinging the Wiimote around like it was a sword and all of that. And I could definitely see why a lot of people don't necessarily enjoy that sort of gameplay aspect. It was one of the first few games that sort of like gave a lot of emphasis on the motion controls, and I could definitely see why that would turn off lots of people. However, from what I've played in this version, while it does still retain the same sort of motion controls as the Wii version, I feel like it's not as arbitrary or counterintuitive as most people would think in terms of a game, especially one that heavily utilizes the motion controls. But one thing that I do definitely appreciate is that they made the motion controls an option that you can do. The other way you're able to play through the game is play it like a necessarily more traditional sort of Zelda game. Although instead of using the face buttons right here to use your different items, you instead do it using the analog stick right here. Mostly because if they were to make it a control scheme that uses the face buttons, a lot of the overall gameplay and combat would sort of have to be completely reworked from the ground up, because the entire combat was based around you swinging at enemies after a certain point in order to actually be able to do damage to them, because the enemies are definitely a lot more smarter compared to enemies in previous Zelda games. They know what direction they need to block in order to deflect your sword swings and all of that. It does definitely give a lot of the fights a lot more sort of strategy to them. You're not necessarily getting to a point where you feel like you're super overpowered, and when you know the gameplay super well, you can just mow down as many enemies as possible. It's the type of game that keeps you on your toes, and I feel like the controls definitely do that very well. However, once I started actually going through the game with the joystick controls, I actually sort of, in a way, find that on occasions a lot better compared to the motion controls. Not necessarily in terms of combat, but I do feel like traversing the world is a lot more easily said than done with the joystick controls, because the main way you get around in this game is by going, of course, you got the games called Skyward Sword, and the game definitely puts a lot of emphasis on you exploring the sky. The central hub of the game, Skyloft, is entirely all the way up in the sky, and in order to get yourself around all around the areas, you got to get yourself used to flying around on these giant birds that all of them use. So yeah, the way you originally piloted these birds in the original game is by tilting the Wii Remote in like a certain way in order to make them, speed up, fly upwards, downwards, all that sort of stuff. It definitely was a sort of awkward way to go play through it, especially in this one in particular, where it seems like you have to constantly recalibrate the Joy-Cons in order to get them facing the right direction. But with the once you have it so that you're actually using the regular controls, you're able to control the birds using just the regular analog stick, and that definitely feels a whole lot better. It still feels a little bit awkward at first, especially when the birds make a sudden stop in their tracks, and the way you have to carefully aim into these giant boost rocks in order to make your bird go faster definitely requires a lot of precision, but eventually you do get used to it, and I feel like exploring all of the sky in order to get all the major areas down below is definitely not as tedious as many people would probably claim it to be. There are other areas to explore in the sky. You know, areas that offer side quests, hidden items, and all that good stuff. Um, Speaking of which, I do feel like going back to sort of the personality that the game has, I do feel like the central hub of the game, Skyloft, is definitely one of the more active hub worlds in the series. Always seems to be something new for you to do. You know, you have all the basic areas needed for you, sort of unlocked right off the bat. Then again, you aren't able to do all the different activities until you go through a certain portion of the game. A lot of the items that you're able to buy aren't available until later on, and of course, a lot of the side quests only fully open up once you get further and further into the game. But I do feel like that sort of encourages the player to keep on going and to see what new stuff you can encounter there. And with the NPC characters given a lot more memorable personalities, I do feel like that does give the player the sort of motivation to get through the game more. Not to necessarily say that other previous Zelda games haven't had characters with personality. You know, you had characters from, you know, primarily from the 3D games, but I feel like the game that most people go to when talking about interesting characters is Majora's Mask. And while that is definitely the case, I do feel like Skyward Sword does a very good job at making you care about what's going on. So overall, I do feel like the game is very enjoyable to play. The controls, while they may take some time to get used to, it is something that you are able to get used to very quickly, and eventually you'll be able to get through the game a whole lot faster. And I feel like the game doesn't necessarily punish you for not knowing exactly where to go. There are times where it does feel like you may want to use something like a walkthrough in order to get through certain areas, especially in the dungeons. There are definitely a lot more. They're definitely a lot more puzzle-centric compared to other Zelda games, and you can get into situations where it seems like you're completely stuck, and then you figure out what the solution is supposed to be, which is something that you completely blazed over when you were going through it the first time, and then it makes yourself think that, you know, you could have done that yourself, but you didn't realize how simple the solution was, which was sort of like me when I went through the first few dungeons. But overall, I do still feel like the dungeons may be very puzzle centric, but I do feel like that's one of the things that makes them very fun to go through for most people, and I think that's also one of the reasons why games like Breath of the Wild, which more or less omitted the traditional sort of dungeons, that's one of the sort of things that many people like to mention when concerning problems with Breath of the Wild. And I do feel like being able to play through this game once again, I feel like a lot of the things that many people probably sort of glossed over, many people appreciate now, especially considering how old this game is. And being able to play through this once again, most people, I feel like, will find a sense of nostalgia and more of an appreciation for the stuff that this game gave us. You know, the bosses are definitely some of the more interesting bosses that we've gotten in Zelda games. Not necessarily all of them have to do exactly with combat, but it allows you to use the items that you get in the dungeons as part of the way you actually go through and beat them. And I do feel like that's something that is really that's really good. It gives you a reason to want to use these items, and the items that you get in this game are definitely a lot more out there compared to the more traditional items that the Zelda series usually gets. You are able to still get items like the boomerang, the bows, you know, all the more traditional sort of items that you get, but you get those much later on, and the first few dungeons in the game introduce you to a couple of new items, which I won't spoil what they are, in case anyone wants to go through the game themselves and haven't done so yet. But they are definitely items that feel unique to this game, and I do like that sort of aspect to it. It gives the game its own sort of flair, while also still feeling like something you would find in a Zelda game. So, overall, I do feel like this game is definitely very fun to go through. If you were one of those people who didn't necessarily enjoy the game originally when it came out, I feel like if you play through this game again, especially with the new control scheme, I do feel like some people will definitely get more of an appreciation for it. Now, this is coming from someone who's considering this a first impressions video on it, because once again, I'm only 1/3 through the main story, so I do feel like a lot of the other aspects of the game that many people are concerned about, the overall lack of areas to explore, the fact that there's quite a lot of backtracking in the game, you know, those sort of fundamental structure sort of issues with Skyward Sword that most people have. I feel like once I sort of discover them, I will kind of have a bit more of an understanding on why many people not necessarily disregard, but sort of give the game a hard time because of that. But I'm not necessarily one of those people who goes out trying to immediately going through a game with sort of low expectations, and overall I still feel like this game has been rather enjoyable. So if you haven't played this game before and you are interested in getting it, I would most definitely recommend it. And if you are one of those people who haven't played this version but played the original on the Wii, it's not necessarily something that completely changes the game, but I do feel like if you give this one, like I said, another go, I feel like it'll get more of an appreciation than it had way back then. So here's hoping that this game does rather well, and here's hoping that Breath of the Wild 2, which will hopefully come out sometime next year, will take cues from, you know, what people like in these games and the more traditional Zelda games, and allow it to sort of learn from what was established in the first Breath of the Wild and sort of implant some of the more traditional aspects of other Zelda games and be even better than the first one. But overall, like I said, I do like this game and I highly recommend it. So I hope you all enjoyed this another episode of Ben Talks About. I'm not quite sure how relevant this video is, considering the game has been out for quite a while now. But of course, I'm the kind of person who does videos on things, even if they're not necessarily relevant, mostly for the sake of I simply feel like it. So until I see you all next time with whatever it is I decide to talk about, I am Ben Contreras, and bye.